basically in my prompt, I think I asked for again one thing, but I got this. Even I really like these images. Even like months later, I invented this backstory. Now, this damage in half-erased pages represents a cultural process typical of all human cultural history. The best ideas and plans in all art genres, from literature to architecture, were frequently never realized and remained only as notes and drafts. Or they were never written down, and therefore simply disappeared completely. I think the same thing goes, of course, for architecture, film, or in all the fields. Right? The universality of this history is emphasized by the text we see in some of these images. It looks like something that is written in some existing language, but actually it's not. AI simulates general patterns of grammar and handwriting, but the text we see is not in any existing language. Okay. So let me, I'm looking at, let me try to fit in maybe two more series. I can, I'll not be able to do all of them, but so let's continue with kind of historical context. So I started to use, I basically came back to making single images, after 15 years of developing what I call cultural analytics, right? Some this work. So it was an attempt to use big data approach and methods from computer vision and AI at the time to analyze cultural trends. And if somebody would ask me 10 years ago, Lev, would you ever be looking, analyzing, or making single images? I would say no. I have no interest in single images. I'm only interested in patterns. But never say no. And then 10 years later, I end up making single images. And I think that perhaps what pushed me to come back to making single images and to try to look at the drawings I made after my migration from Soviet Union, in the early 80s, was of course the beginning of a Putin war in Russia, right, in February of 2022, which was a completely shocking event to me. I've been visiting Russia. I've been in Russia 17 times between 2015 and 2020, teaching, participating in various projects. I developed friendship with many people, and it was a wonderful, wonderful period. And in a way, it was like my return, right? My return to a country which I left 40 years later. And then, obviously, the war didn't affect me, right? In a kind of practical way where it affected millions of people in Ukraine, and in Russia. But, and then Russia was kind of gone, right? So the way that I lost Russia for the second time, and within months, out of 15 friends I had in Russia, 13 immigrated, right? So now Russia exists, all over the world, right? As artists, academics, IT people, have end up all over, right? From US to Germany, from Israel to Kazakhstan, from Armenia to Sweden. So I was visiting Venice Biennale, a few weeks ago, and in fact, half of my Russian friends, were rare because people came to Venice Biennale opening because now we live in different countries. So perhaps it was like the emotional shock, right, which I felt after war got started, which motivated me to come back to images as opposed to simply continue like my usual scholarly production. I'm not sure. So, but anyway, but the reason I'm saying it It's a preface to yet another image series, which I think was one of a few I made in 2022, responding emotionally to this sense of horror, right? And kind of feeling like almost frozen inside, like me and many people I knew felt, in the first 3 months of a war. And at the same time, as I was like reflecting about, developing emerging new media or generative AI, you'll see that in this image series, I'm also trying to reflect and say something about the specificity of this new artistic media. So the series is called, just see how it's called, After a Long War, right? After a Long War. Just a moment. Okay, here it is. Yeah. After a Long War. So generative AI is seen by many as a new artistic tool. The word tool implies that AI is a tool for its creator, the way, for example, Caesar, right, is a tool, right? Or a pen is a tool, helping her realize her concept and dreams. Now, in the way I think we normally think about the tools, and I think that's the difference between the tool versus medium, perhaps, is tools are supposed to be passive. They cannot do anything on their own, right? So the pen is not going to draw anything unless I instruct it to. And, I have to give it very precise instructions, right? I have to draw with a pen so it will leave marks on the paper. However, after a few months, right, of using and being very excited about generative AI, as many other people, including some people here, of course, in the summer of 2022, I started to kind of realize that I started to think about my experience with generative AI as a kind of conflict, as my own internal war with a very powerful adversary. Right? So for a year and a half, during which I was using this AI tools to make images almost every day, I kind of stopped now, because I think now it's a period of reflection. It seemed to be like a context of war against formidable, obviously very clear opponents who have goals that diverge from mine, right? So it's possible, right, to compare working with generative AI is like having a studio with hundreds of assistants, which at first would look like a dream of every artist, because only very, very successful artists, right, have money to have studios with hundreds of assistants. Except with assistants, with AIs, seem to sometimes have a mind of their own, right? Now, so what specifically I'm talking about here? So during generative AI training, a computer extracts frequently occurring patterns from the data. You all know that. Infrequent patterns are ignored. Thus, when you use a trained AI model to create new images, it frequently produces content that, to the eyes of a, very experienced artist, so somebody like me, who basically started to learn art over 50 years ago, right? And spent most of his life teaching art, right? It may come to a surprise to some of you, but my jobs at university were professor of art. I was teaching art students, never theory. So, so I think, I'm not saying I'm a good artist or bad artist. I think the images I'm showing you are interesting, but I mean, but I have good eyes, right? So, because of this kind of basic, I think, the key characteristic, right, of neural networks. It's the same characteristic which generative AI shares with most of data science algorithms, and also with statistics. Going back to the 18th century, the statistics, right, develop descriptive statistics in the 18th century, 19th century developed as a set of methods for summarizing data, right, compressing data. So you don't represent individual cases, right? You aggregate individual cases into categories. So when you visualize the categories as bars, for example, right, or as a pieces of a pie. If you do cluster analysis, right, you try to cluster the data into a set of clusters, and so on and so forth, right? If you do regression analysis, right, you try to fit the curve or a straight line from the data, and you're hoping that most of the data will lie along this curve. So the whole kind of enterprise of statistics, which then becomes machine learning in 1950s, which then becomes data science in the 2000s, which is now, kind of feeds into the AI, is based on the idea of aggregation, reduction, and summarization, right? And one specific mechanism in which this is working of generative AI training is whatever is frequent in the data, right, is going to be learned, right? Whatever patterns occur frequently, will be remembered and then can be reproduced during generation, and something which is infrequent will be not. And this is why, right, those of us, of course, lots of artists who haven't been really trained in the arts, because we have been to art schools and we've only been trained to write like artist statements and to speak the art speak. But most of us who've been actually trained visually, right, or have visual skills, we often use these AI tools and we say, well, it's great, except the results seem to be a bit cliche, a bit common, a bit stereotypical. Right? Especially if you're trying to generate something which is new, right? So if I say generate a portrait of a person, street photography, it may look completely perfect. But if I say generate something which is actually infrequent in the data, something which didn't exist before, I may get the image which tends to be more stereotypical because the AI hasn't seen the kind of composition, the kind of subjects I'm trying to do. So when I'm substituting something it has seen for something unique I'm trying to do, right? So to me, this is, the basic, right? The key limitation. I mean, every media has its own limitation. So this is, the biggest limitation of generative media, especially if you're trying to make something new, which has very few analogs in the existing data, in the existing kind of visual web. You can have to struggle to get enough uniqueness, enough detail, enough specificity, because the statistical kind of predictive machinery, right, likes to reproduce frequent patterns, and if it doesn't have if it hasn't seen what you're trying to do, it may sometimes very obviously, sometimes in a very subtle way, substitute something more commonplace for what you had in your mind, which was something unique. So I have been using a number of strategies to avoid this and to get the AI to generate more unique images that fit my particular aesthetic criteria, but usually it's a real struggle. Sometimes I use long and deliberately ambiguous text prompts to confuse the AI, so the generated image is ambiguous. I also usually include a number of reference images along with text prompt. And sometimes I don't specify any text prompt at all, but only use multiple images as my prompt. So in this particular series, which was done earlier, like around October, November 2022, I used a different approach. So I kind of try to use a different approach to deal with this kind of fundamental challenge of generative media. So I noticed, when every time I would type a prompt to include the word Moscow, I would get images that would always show the Kremlin all Russian churches, or it will be released some architecture or classical appearance. Again, it may be different today with Midjourney version 6, but this is what was happening with Midjourney version 4. So apparently, generative AI learned these visual stereotypes of Russia from millions of images on the internet with the part of this training data. So I thought, okay, so if if this kind of cliches are inevitable, what I can do? So I thought, okay, maybe I can like play on, and as opposed to trying to get rid of them, I will leave them while altering their context, right? Rather than trying to get rid of them, right? So I basically made these images, and I call the series After the Long War. In some of my prompts, I actually was more specific. I would say Russia in 2028, after like a long war, Russia in 2032, and kind of using different tricks, right? I kind of created this, right, kind of like anti-utopian, right, kind of image of like Russia destroyed by its own war, and that was in a way like that was a way like I kind of almost punished AI for putting these obligatory churches in images of Kremlin. Of course, I'm not, I don't want, this to happen in Russia, but you never know. And it's interesting that maybe these images anticipate something, because I think in the fall of 2022, it was impossible to predict that a year later, Ukraine would be routinely kind of sending like, drones, and the drones will be constantly attacking various Russian kind of military, aerodromes or oil refineries and so on. So maybe in some cases anticipate something. So I think I don't want to leave you with kind of like maybe somewhat of macabre imagery. So let me end with one more, which is one of my favorites. So it's called In the Garden. And then we can go to questions, right? Okay, so this series is inspired by formal French gardens of the 17th and 18th century in architecture and also ornament of that period. I also wanted the AI to simulate the look of old engravings and etchings. And what's interesting is that the reference to this media influenced the subjects depicted in the generated images. Right? So lines represent everything in graphic art, and the world itself is made from lines in my images. So curvy lines become plans, straight ones become this kind of strange poles in the landscape, and diagonal ones become wires stretching between them. So what happened here is that I was like typing a prompt, and as a part of a prompt, I had a phrase which I thought was describing the kind of like the aesthetics, right? The media aesthetic, which I wanted the AI to do. So I said something like very thin, long lines, drawn in pencil, etching, engraving. But because I was not explicit enough, right? The AI misunderstood me, and in fact, it kind of put these lines into the world, right? So what I got is this, I think, interesting and I think beautiful poetic conflation between medium and the message, where like on the one hand, yes, it does look like we're etching, it does look like we're drawing. So again, referencing the original drawings and early etchings I made 40 years ago, but the content of this world itself is in fact the medium, right? In other words, the lines is not only the technique, but the world itself is made from its lines. And then, of course, you also can probably recognize beautiful artifacts generated by a particular version of a zoom and pen commands, which we introduced in Midjourney, I think, version 5. So the series also makes use of the specific artifacts of AI zoom out command symmetries and repetitions of compositional elements. This seemed appropriate given the topic of formal gardens. Again, right, I thought, great. So when you kind of zoom out on your pen, at some point, like AI almost seems to run out of energy. Things start repeating. As well, the simulation kind of loses its intensity, right? The simulation becomes weaker. And that's, well, it actually does look like a kind of formal European gardens, right? With kind of repeating symmetries. So here you can see how like, the world generated in one image. When you zoom out, and then it turns out it's like this kind of small world enclosed in a large world. And again, this aesthetic of kind of theater and simulation is something I really liked from my teenage days. So that's why I like this series. So in some images, the initial world have been enclosed by elaborate frames that are nested inside other frames. Our world, which for us feels real, is only the stage enclosed in our world. So I think, I mean, I can go on, but maybe it's time to stop so we can have a discussion. Up to moderators.
Well, if you feel ready to stop, then I'm sure we have lots of thoughts and questions, but...
Yeah, okay, sure.
Okay.
I'll stop, yeah, I'll stop, yeah. I have a lot more, but I think I'll stop. I'll stop here. Yeah, okay, so let me...
Thank you, Lev. Thank you so much. That's very, it makes me think quite hard about some things. And Paul asked me to maybe engage you in conversation for 5 minutes or so. So if I just share some of the things that occurred to me, and we have already 3 or 4 questions, so I can move straight to them. But what I was thinking about, and I don't know if any of it is resonant, certainly thinking about the idea of Traumaliteratur, the Heinrich Böll idea after the Second World War in Germany, a lot of literature of ruins and architecture of ruins. It's a whole kind of, there's a whole field in a way of aesthetic expression. Your work really made me think as well of, I was rereading The Language of New Media, and I was sort of looking at your comments about Benjamin and Virilio, the small optics. I don't know if you remember that section, but you're talking about close-ups and Benjamin's view of the desire of the masses to bring things closer spatially and humanly. You quoted, to get hold of an object at very close range. And then you're obviously focusing much more on big optics, but in a sense, it's like a resurgence of the small optic that you seem to me to be bringing to the fore in your own, the kind of erasure, the manuscripts, which I find extremely moving and quite kind of relevant to some of the things I'm interested in. So do you think you're revisiting some of your own history in a way, also in theoretical terms, in these practice-based works that you're making manifest?
Well, thank you. It's a great comment. One series which I usually show in these talks, but I didn't show it this time. It's actually called kind of Fragments, and it's actually my favorite, where I basically get AI to create this world, which seems to be in the process of formation, or maybe in the process of destruction. So it's kind of made of fragments. And I was thinking more about this, the aesthetics and fascination of ruins in the 18th century, right? Like in Italy. So I'm actually not really much aware about this kind of literature and writing about ruins after a war. Although, the other day I was watching this wonderful documentary about Anselm Kiefer by the Wenders, and right, there's a famous story how Kiefer, who was born in 1945, he kind of grows up as a small child, kind of playing in the ruins of destroyed houses after a war, and definitely I think his art is maybe yet another manifestation of his ruins. I think just to continue a bit of a personal, for me, so, I kind of grew up, right, in this world, very close world with my parents, in a kind of anti-Semitic kind of world of late USSR, where as intellectuals, as Jews, like our family is very very connected, and kind of where our families, and then there's this outside kind of hostile kind of potentially communist environment. So that was also a close world of my family, right? In my childhood, and then we decided to immigrate, and then things started to disintegrate. I mean, I'm not going to go into the whole story. I will tell it in public one day. But after I arrived to New York, right, at the age of 21, basically my parents were destroyed in the process of this immigration, by the Soviet system, and plus I'm 21, right, and I arrived from a different planet, from a completely different society. So I did all the right things. I went to NYU. I started to study film. When I saw computer graphics, I did all the right things, and obviously, I put myself together, right? And this is the Lev, and you quote in my book. But I think for many years after immigration, I had a feeling that I myself was a kind of ruin, right? That I myself was like this kind of floating in some space, and I didn't have a sense of ground, So for me, this idea of ruins or this integration, I think it also would happen to our family and my own kind of psychological understanding, of myself and my reality. So in terms of revisiting my theoretical points, I don't think I'm doing it consciously. Usually I never read, I kind of usually don't read my early articles, because there are so many. But you never know, right? Just because I don't do it consciously, who knows what happens on other levels?
Yeah.
And I like your attention to this point. One thing I want to say is that both in my original manual drawings and also in this AI works, right? Details, right, are very important, and the miniature and a kind of very fine lines. And I think partly it comes from my architectural training, right? So to get into architecture school, when I was still living in Moscow, which was the only school where we would accept Jews, I couldn't go to university, I couldn't go to art school. I had to get this very classical art training, and then became very focused on kind of fine shading, small details. But there's maybe some other psychological reasons why I like miniature, right? Why I like the set. It's also a kind of world in which you can create meaning.
Yeah.
Right. So if you ask me to zoom out from these little sets, I think what's outside, I haven't shown it yet, but maybe it's a kind of vacuum. It's a kind of endless space. Is this, this kind of, space, I don't know, this kind of cosmos or maybe ancient Greek philosophy completely different to our existence, right? Or the space of contemporary astronomy. So we build this kind of frame of references for ourselves, these miniature worlds in which we create meanings. Our families, our professional fields, our occupations, and we play the roles. And there's something about the smallness also of this world, right?
So
Anyway, I'm just on the kind of on the multiple tangents. I'll stop here.
Yeah, I
hope it
put
makes-
it, the first question that was asked right at the beginning,
Okay, yes.
very relevant
Yes.
to your last point,
Okay.
was with your investment and
Oh,
labor
wow, great.
in the gesture of drawing,
Yes. So, yes.
when does artistic gesture have any meaning or value when AI images are pixel based?
I'm just looking at the questions. Oh my God, this will be all so
Yeah, it's probably
fantastic.
better to read them. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think so. I think this idea of artistic gesture, right? I think can mean multiple things. It can mean artistic gesture as intention, because people often say, well, you know, the AI doesn't have intention, human artists have intention, and you know what kind of also makes something art is not its formal properties today, but the intention. Or it can also refer to like gesture, right, in the sense of like, you know, okay, kind of whether it is, you know, Jackson Pollock or, you know, Rembrandt or whoever else, right? It could be a very small gesture, it can be a very big gesture. So the line is emerging out of gesture. I don't think I can answer this like, adequately at 4 o'clock in the morning, because also it's a very good question. But you know what I think is that lots of modern 20th century and kind of contemporary art, right? The artists leave their gestures visible, right? So there's a kind of one kind of like aesthetics where we finish everything, right? Where like things are finished and, you know, the gestures, the marks, the movements of the hand, which produce brushstroke or lines, have been erased. But in a way, the kind of the modern art, let's say from Impressionist and Van Gogh up until today, right? There's also another line where you kind of where the painting is a record of set of gestures. You know, people talk about photography, right? People used to talk about photography before AI. We used to say, well, photography is a record of what happened in a particular moment in space and time. Perhaps, right? So from that point of view, many kind of modern visual artworks are the records of a set of gestures or certain behavior, right, which happened. And I think we look at this, and I think our body and our mind reacts to it in a way which art theory or history maybe never described, but which is kind of deeply meaningful to us, right? In other words, you know, when we're looking at particular painting or engraving or, you know, lithograph, etc. I mean, well, maybe etc. It's almost like we are maybe in our mind, we're like replaying the activity of artists and all the gestures which have been made, right?
Sure.
And I think this gives this visual art works of art, right, a very particular meaning, right? And when you kind of simulate it, right, maybe it is you simulate like in Photoshop, right, or you simulate it with AI, yeah, visually it looks the same, but because it is just pixels, it may not have the same meaning, right? It may not have the same meaning. And I guess that's why, you know, we go to museums, we go to galleries, we go to exhibitions, and we look at things which are particular scale, made in particular material, because again, I think maybe final way I will try to answer this question. I think from the 19th century onward, right, or maybe earlier, we start, you know, there's this kind of gradual arrival of a modern concept of image. So image is something which is rectangular, and even before digital, in a way, it's like this disembodied set of pixels, right? Or disembodied set of like, you know, like half tones, right? So something which is very disembodied, right? But now, this is what AI can simulate perfectly, right? And what becomes valuable, right? What becomes more valuable after AI is precisely the image, not as information, right? Like in a kind of like, you know, I know you had some presentation about Max Benzer, right? And some months ago. So image is not as information, but almost image as a kind of like as a recording of a performance, right? Image of a kind of human gesture, right? Sorry, I know I'm not being very kind of like
Oh, I think
clear,
that's
but I
wonderful.
hope it's going somewhere. Anyway,
Yeah.
okay. Then the
That's-
next one was question. Okay, can I go to the next one? Okay. What's V4 the goal nature of Midjourney? Yeah. Well, you know, I would say, yeah, thanks, Rolf. Yeah, I would say, you know, so I think, you know how like in the 60s and 70s, right, was a big movement in photography, experimental film. People started to work with like early 19th century processes. We started, you know, to work with pinhole cameras, etc., etc. So I would say that I think if we look at the kind of history of probably any artistic media, right, at each stage, right, so to speak, right, if there is something unique, right, some unique things exist when later disappear, right? So what I want to say is that obviously, right, like in Midjourney version 6, right, or whatever the next version will be, version 7, etc., etc. Yes, it has high resolution, it's more sharp, and it's better at understanding your prompt. But at the same time, as I've written in one of my Facebook posts, in a way, in a very kind of, you know, in a kind of paradoxical way, as AI is becoming more and more powerful, it's becoming less of an AI. So what I mean by this, right, is with version 3, version 4, I would write the prompt, and the AI will misunderstand me. It will produce some strange things, such as these images which I showed with kind of library series, with strange text. And it was basically a complete mistake, but it was a beautiful mistake. And it will be kind of more difficult, right, to make a mistake now, because now it actually understands what I want, and it kind of renders what I want, right? You know, and people like at, you know, people at OpenAI and Midjourney and Facebook, great, you know, our systems are understanding your prompts very well, which is great for casual users, so great for culture industry. But for artists such as me, who actually want the AI to be maybe 70%, who actually want to delegate your subjectivity and personality to AI, this is maybe sad news, right? Because you actually want the AI to make some crazy mistakes and misinterpret you. So if the AI is like completely understands it perfectly, it just becomes like a rendering engine.
Sure.
So from this point of view, right, I think many people would say that yes, version 3, version 4 was in a way there was something unique there, which is, you know, which is not available today.
Yeah.
Should I go on?
Yeah, why don't you? Yeah.
Great. Okay. I just want to before I talk another question, I just want to say the drawings are very reminiscent of a Paul Noble work. I'm so happy. Oh my God, you made this is why I knew I should do it for, you know, I knew what getting up, you know, talking at 4 o'clock in the morning. So I basically didn't really, surprisingly, right, I didn't know about his work. So as I kind of came back to this image making and drawing, right, 2 years ago, I started looking for contemporary artists. Like I know the historical artists who I like, right? But I started looking for contemporary artists who I feel particular affinity, and I discovered his work. And in fact, indeed, right, his drawings is probably probably very kind of inspirational. But as I said, I only found them like in the last year, so it's like 40 years after I made my early drawings, etc., etc. although I think he kind of starts maybe more of architecture, whereas in my case, well, I mean, there's lots of similarity. Okay, okay, let me go back. We'll find new uncanniness for increasing literacy. Okay, this I'm not sure. Okay, Ben Bogart, I'm not sure I fully understand this question. Will we find new uncanniness for increasing literacy, regardless of realism? I'm not sure I fully understand. Sorry, but maybe you can ask me like later. Send me a message. I'm not sure I fully understand. Physical senses movement. Okay. What else? Anything else?
Okay.
Anything else? I think that's
Yeah, there was. Just trying to see. Was version 4 the golden age of Midjourney? The
I
point
talked about it. Yeah,
you've
I
done
talked
that
about
one.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I
Well,
think
there's a question about at the moment the outcomes of Midjourney look like Midjourney. Well, I think if you listen to whatever person who asked this question, if you actually listen to my talk, right, I did talk specifically about with some of the techniques I use
yeah.
to avoid it. And in fact, people often say that my images do not look like images, but that's because I use multiple like I use like in addition to the text prompt, right? I also usually put multiple images. So I use image to image model, and that's like so in a way kind of forcing the journey to act more almost as like a remixing machine, or maybe it gives it particular specificity. Yes, I think that you're actually wrong, right? I wouldn't say that Midjourney looks like Midjourney because it can, it can simulate the looks of hundreds of different media and tens of thousands of different artists. So I recommend you visit a very popular website like Mid Library, which is like a reference for this. But I think it's true that if you simply give it very short prompts, then you do get a particular kind of Midjourney aesthetics. So it is, you basically get it kind of house style, which is programmed to do. But there are ways to avoid it. Okay.
Lev, I've got another question for you.
Yeah, I can see that. Yes.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to.
Yes. Okay. Well, it's okay. It's okay. We can probably talk later. Yes.
Can I ask you a question about?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted, maybe we could end maybe on this point because I think you've covered a lot. But I just wanted to sort of ask you a little bit about history because it was in the title of your talk.
Sure.
And one of the things I read last year was that Sam Altman said that what they wanted to do is build computers safe enough, smart enough to end history, to thrust humanity into an era of unimaginable bounty. And I don't know, you're talking about paradoxes, and they often also say that it's the early stages of a technology that are the most interesting phase for artists. You can trace that back centuries. Is the idea of ending history in any way appealing to you? I know you quite often express an affirmative approach to using, it's almost still an avant-garde modernist approach to embracing what is emergent. how do you, I mean, how are you personally navigating the sense of history and memory with respect to both your theory and practice in this emergent phase of generative AI?
That's that's a wonderful but huge question. So I should go make some coffee. I'll try to say something. So some people may remember, right, that there was this idea about the end of history. Basically, basically at the end, right, at the end of Soviet Union, so 1989, 1981, when kind of communist regimes collapsed all over Eastern Europe, because for decades prior to that, right, the world has been structured by the competition, right, between the kind of, the Western world, right, led by US, and this, let's say, communist world, right, led by Soviet Union, with dozens of countries being, in a way, kind of places where this competition and kind of war played out. And then, when it was over, I think there was some, right, very famous arguments about the end of history or the end of ideology. But I think what this argument meant was, now that, like, there's like one ideology which remains, right, or like we entered with kind of post-ideological world, there is no history now, like in this horizontal plane. But of course, the history has come back, right? I mean, there is a very clear sense, which I'm sure felt by lots of people in the last 5 or so years, that we're like back, in the 1950s, so back in the 1940s, right? So there's a new war in Europe, right? The war is led by the president of Russia, who is basically a KGB officer, right? Who was trained in the 20th century ideologies. There's this new competition between Russia and America, right? There's always like ideological tensions, right? There's lots of hatred. There's this huge sudden rise of anti-Semitism in the world, right? We see all these students, chanting slogans which we don't understand, but which are clearly, call for a, end of Israel across dozens of campuses, right? So we're very much back in kind of like vicious 20th century kind of history and ideology, right?
Yeah.
So in fact, there's a sense where kind of, it's almost like we're moving back in time, right? Yeah. We're moving back in time. And also, when I kind of watch, when I read and watch like Russian official, media channels, right? Yeah, it's like always formulations, always discourse, which I knew as a child, very repeating it like word for word, right? But enemy, America is our enemy. And it's like very surprising because it's like these young people, right, who like grew up, who are younger than me. So but somehow like it all came back. It's almost like was stored somewhere and came back, right? I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think with Sam Altman, I don't know what he meant, but he probably not meant by this. Now, so that's one thing. The second thing is, there's a sense in which the development, right, of the web in the 90s and the zeros already kind of flattens a kind of cultural history, right? Because you go to a museum, right, and in museums, things are put like in kind of historical framework, and things are organized by periods, and museum tells this kind of historical narratives. And when all this cultural information, all this cultural knowledge, all this cultural media, right, kind of goes onto the web, and then everything becomes kind of flattened, right? Everything becomes spatial, and somebody TikTok video isn't, like it's like looks as important or as easily accessible as some movie by Godard or something else, right? So there's a sense of certain collapse of hierarchies, and collapse of historical narratives, right? And definitely, we have seen this in the arts, right? So modernism was very much aware, right, of history. It was constructing itself in history, right? So every new ism would say, no, you guys are wrong. We are the real art of modernity, right? Etc. Etc. And then it starts all collapsing kind of in the 80s, right? And now we live in this age where you can make work in any style, you can use any form. It doesn't matter. And there are certain trends, right? So let's say you go to Venice Biennale, and then you can see this big trend for artists using embroidery, right? This kind of work. But it's like this, little trends come and go, right? Etc. Etc. Right? So so we can say that okay. So let me bring this set of random I'm like a misfunctioning AI, right? Okay, but okay, but I think I know what I'm going to say now. So okay, so let me summarize what I just said. Okay, so here's what we have, right? So I think that in terms of social, economic, ideological world, right, we are very much back in the world of history and ideology, ideological conflicts, right? Think about the whole conflict, right? I mean, think about today, right? About Gaza and Israel. It's all about these historical narratives, right? Who was the first who owned this land? Who misplaced who, right? That's very historical, right? So definitely you can see that this is an example of how history is used, misused, or how Putin constantly gives these lectures about history, right? Etc. Right? So we're definitely back, and so in terms of ideology and society and war, we're definitely in the historical world, right? And then I think if we look at the world of visual arts, right? This is Computer Art Society. I almost feel very nostalgic, right? I wish some of this history will come back, right? Because ultimately, maybe what gave real energy to artists of previous periods is very revolting against something, right? Very revolting against previous generations, very revolting against different isms. But now there's nothing to revolt against because everything is okay. In fact, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, if you look at the world of art biennales, it doesn't even matter what your art is, as long as you represent global south and et cetera, right? And you say the right things, right, et cetera. It's almost like what's inside the pavilion doesn't matter, almost, right? Almost. So it's extreme formalism, right? So the sense that everything is allowed and nudity is okay, abstraction is okay, figuration is okay, doesn't really matter, everything is okay. Maybe this is why contemporary art became so boring. Because everything is allowed and you don't revolt against nothing. There's no taboos, right? There's no taboos. So I'm not sure where I would take you, but I think if you're kind of growing up in a world and everything is allowed, you want to be pink, it's okay. You want to be blue, it's okay. You want to be abstract, it's okay. You want to use the eyes, okay. You want to paint with your fingers, it's okay. Then how do you develop strong kind of wishes, art? I don't know. So that's a question, right? So how do we get history back into the art? Maybe that's a question, How in our words, is the pluralism we now have in art in the last 20 years, is it actually self-defeating? Is it a kind of illness which in a way is eating the art from inside? Well, that's a dark and provocative question, and maybe that's where I'm going to end. So, Susan? Sorry, Sean? Hello?
Hello.
Okay.
Have we lost Brona?
Yes, yes.
Ah,
Anyway,
okay.
I think we lost her, but I think that's probably enough anyway.
Yeah, that was a really interesting talk actually, and very thought-provoking. If we have finished our questions, then I'm happy for us to finish here. Are there any more questions?
Well,
If I was just wondering if any people like Paul or any of our committee members want to say anything. Ah, here's Brona coming back.
you coming back?
Rolf, you just raised your hand. Yeah. Oh.
Okay.
No, sorry, I was just doing the applause,
Okay.
discreetly
No
applaud,
problem,
because
yeah.
I thought, out of humanity, I thought we were letting Lev go and get some sleep.
Yeah, you need to get some sleep.
I was just saying thank
Brona,
you.
you're back. We lost you a bit, but I think we were just about to finish up.
Yes, well, I'm so sorry. That was the moment of closure,
Okay.
clearly. But let
Anyway,
me
it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Anyway,
I
yes.
just want to say thank you to Lev for such a generous presentation, talk, sharing. And I know I will be among those listening back, and wish you a very good sleep. And thank you very much for.
Thank you so
all of
much.
that.
We should get all good evening, and want to leave you with just reiterate the last thing I said. How do we fight pluralism, right? No, because it's like, right, on the one hand, like, I think when during the kind of this modernism straitjacket, people said, oh my God, I can't do this, I can't do this. And now you can do everything.
Mm.
And when you can do everything, it's a bit, it can be a bad thing too,
Yeah.
So, so maybe, again, I don't have like, it's like, I mean, it's a huge, I don't have a solution, but let me just say one thing. But I think this is where, like, I want to bring it back to AI, right? So, as I've been doing these experiments, people invite me to be in some group shows. I had some personal shows, and now I'm like, okay, I can fire up AI, and I can basically make like nice images because I know how to do them, and people like them. But if I can do everything, and I can do everything, but I can do millions of different things with AI. Why should I do anything, right? So the fact that this medium is so powerful, it's almost dispowering me. So I kind of want to go and take like a pen and make a drawing. And it takes me maybe 50 hours to make a drawing. And simply the complexity of drawing prevents me from making particular things, etc., right? So it's almost like the fact that AI is like super powerful. And when the key question becomes, why should I do this as opposed to that, right? I can do something and I can emulate the styles of hundreds of different artists. Then why do I select this style? Why do I select this particular topic? So in my case, maybe I was kind of focused with talk on particularly selecting image series, which I have grounded in my own personal experience and my own, let's say, trauma or my etc. Because maybe that becomes a limiting factor, right?
Yes.
So I admire very much people. Like, again, I'm not comparing myself obviously to any of them, but I really admire people like Kiefer, because obviously his art is like in a very material, visual, deep way is rooted in his personal experience. So maybe that becomes limiting factor, for example, right? But of course, you have to translate the personal experience into something universal, so it'll be relevant to other people, as opposed to, right? Obviously, I'm not interested to make art about my identity because I don't have an identity, right? I don't have one, right? So it's been fractured. Anyway, sorry, I can go on and
I
on.
mean, we could continue.
I think that's probably enough, everybody.
That brings us to
Thank you.
memory, and I think it's been incredibly memorable, this whole conversation. And once again, just on behalf of everyone, a very, very big
Yeah.
thank you. Really grateful.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and
Bye-bye.
we'll finish there.